Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Atif Ansari and I'm the Sales Account Manager at Aurora. Aurora is the leading provider of cybersecurity solutions and products. And today we are presenting an exclusive Defend webinar presented by Edwin Davis, who's the Senior Cybersecurity Solutions Architect here at Aurora. We'll be covering all the benefits of Defend and how it can help your organization. And just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box. We'll go over all your questions at the end. We request that you keep yourself on mute during the entire presentation to avoid any distractions. And now, without further delay, I will hand it over to Edwin, our expert, who will take you through the presentation. Edwin, it's all yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Atif. Thanks again for taking the time to join us today for the Defend webinar. My name is Edwin Davis, Senior Solutions Architect and Cybersecurity Engineer over at Aurora. Aurora has been part of the Pluralock family since the spring of last year. And Pluralock is a cybersecurity company that provides advanced and continuous authentication for standards and regulatory compliance. Pluralock software leverages the state-of-the-art, behavior biometrics, environmental, and contextual technologies to provide invisible, adaptive, and risk-based MFA solutions. And this integration has really helped us over at Aurora to allow us to be able to provide a better set of offerings for our clients to receive a more robust and comprehensive identity authentication solution, which I'm very excited today to introduce to you guys, which is called Defend. The best way to kick things off would be for me to, start with the exciting stuff, essentially, right? A real-time simulated use case of Defend product in action, securing an endpoint. So let's go ahead and do that. Just before I jump into it, though, I'd like to frame things up for you guys around securing the endpoint. So we all know, having been in the industry for some time, that really there's no surprise that the weakest link of our organization's network are its people, right? And what they use to access that data, which is no surprise at all, is the endpoint, whether it be a laptop or desktop. Endpoints inherently are extremely vulnerable to attacks, everything from ransomware, credential theft, rogue AP, email attacks, and otherwise. And a fair number of us during this time, obviously with COVID, have had a false sense of security around security working from home these days, as well as those who have to kind of do both and split going between home and the office. But regardless of how it stands, it's definitely a daunting task or challenge for us as security professionals to try to protect those machines because the control is left to the user. And they have access to data either directly or indirectly through those devices. So now I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time necessarily explaining about all the possible vulnerabilities and how they can be exploited by a threat. So I'm just going to jump into two simulated attacks, use cases, scenarios with Defend running specifically on my machine to kind of give you an example of this. And I'm going to frame up the scenario for you based on two types of attacks. The first one I'm going to be doing is more of a passive attack and was quite prominent back in 2018 when a widespread of fileless attacks against the financial institution were conducted across the world. And a fileless attack, for those who are not familiar with it, is really a type of malicious activity that uses native, legitimate tools built on the system itself to execute a cyber attack. And this is different from your traditional malware, basically because typically in that scenario, you'd have an attacker potentially install code on a target system and then take the attack based on that. And it also leaves it harder to detect by it being fileless. So the first step in sort of this attack scenario would be for the actual attacker to gain administrative privileges, right? I have Mimikatz, which many of you may know, which is an actual vulnerability tool that was used technically for good use initially until it got into the wrong hands and became malware, but it's used to collect credential information. It's an open source application that allows users to view and save authentication credentials, such as Kerberos tickets. And this is going to be deployed, or actually it's been used essentially in this use case to pull that password information. And then the next step in this will be to run a PowerShell script that could potentially live in the registry and then generate Metasploit scripts that would execute using Windows SC service. Okay. So essentially, and then additionally to that, actually, we would have the NetSH tool that would be used for communication between the victim and a C2. And by C2, I mean command and control, which is typically a means by being able to send commands from a compromised machine, which in my case would be mine, over to potential attackers' infrastructure and pull stolen data from it. Okay? I'm not going to be doing all the steps within this attack as I've described them, but I will simulate the most critical part of it, which is really the scenario around executing the series of PowerShell commands via WMIC that will run essentially on my machine to pull certain information, such as like system information, service lists, user account and domain credentials, as well as administrator account information. All these things would be highly sensitive and can be generated basically running from a PowerShell. And these commands will be briefly visible to you guys as I run through this, just based on the nature of the demonstration. But I'd like to run this, and it would typically run passively, ideally, to avoid any type of detection. Okay, so let's jump into this here real quickly. So I'm going to stop sharing and then switch to my entire screen. Okay, so you should be able to see a PowerShell command or a PowerShell window running in the background here. And we can go ahead and execute the script. And boom, you'll notice that the machine has been locked out as a result of that script running. Again, this would be running more dormant, again, passively in the background and unaware to the user. But you'll notice that once the script was executed, my machine locked out. So I'm going to go ahead and log back in here. Great. Okay. Now, the second attack scenario, which I'm going to show, is more of an active one, where the attacker has stolen the credentials, again, maybe potentially by the same means as before, using Mimikatz, or via some other method. Once they've logged in, the attacker now will perform manual operations, such as like typing an email, potentially of malicious intent internally. And in this case, it becomes very damning, right? Because we don't have the need for domain spoofing, for example, in which case, you're external and you're trying to spoof the domain. In this case, I'm already locally on the machine and there's no need for any of that. The other option is they could deploy code as well, any type of deploy some malware on the machine as well. And so that would be another option. So let's go ahead and I'm going to share again. Okay, so I just have an email on the screen. Let me go ahead and okay, so you notice there I was continuing to type. This can be calibrated, but you notice that my machine is locked out again. So I basically was on the victim's machine, typing as an attacker, and the machine has locked me up. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So naturally, your next question at this point will be, well, how does all of this work? And it's great you showed us this, but how does all this work? So let's move on to that. So essentially, a key goal over a Plurilock is really to aid our clients in the effort to achieve the requirement standard for ZTA, right? Zero Trust Architecture, specifically based on the NIST 800-207. And specifically around the continuous monitoring requirements that are very heavily referenced within the various tenets within that framework. So now, if you've ever had the opportunity to read this publication, you will see that there is a lot of information around identity and continuous authentication for each request. And to that point, they don't actually give you in the publication any recommendations that by checking the identity once, that would satisfy this condition, right? And fulfill the standard set forth, which would actually indirectly actually contradict what ZTA stands for, right? It's really about never trust and always verify, which is the model, Forrester researcher analyst, John Kindervag, who actually created it, had set out to do initially. However, what it does talk about is about the continuous monitoring of identities, right? The fact of the matter is that the forms of authentication that are out there currently right now are at a single point in time. Therefore, the further away from the actual time that the authentication takes place, the less trust there is naturally that you would have in the identity of the person being who they are claiming to be. And MFA as well, it's along with facial recognition or other methods that have increased your percentage of verifying who you say you really are, but it's not 100%. And specifically speaking, MFA does have some vulnerabilities associated with it. And to that point, if you authenticate a user with great identity scores with MFA, biometrics methods at that single point in time, that again slips away as you move between like 5 minutes, 10 minutes, even an hour later when the user has continuously worked. We're not certain that authentication happening in that period of time is in fact the actual user an hour later when the user's been continually working and potentially has their OS set to not lock their screen or have stepped away from the desk, whichever. The asset is now potentially vulnerable. And again, we don't know the true identity of that person hours later. The result is that essentially anybody, a remote attacker, can potentially compromise that machine. The other point I wanted to make here is that the majority of the authentication methods require a user to do something, right? If you have a fingerprint, if you're doing fingerprint scanning, you'd have to scan it. You physically have to have that piece of technology on the machine itself. Or if you're using a YubiKey, you physically need the key to be able to do that. And this would potentially introduce trust back into the zero trust environment based on something, right? Either a device that you have that's managed or a certificate on a machine. Okay, so you really would have to introduce that back into that. This leaves you with a number of concerns, right? Essentially about their verification. And there are a lot of solutions out there that do this. However, not very many that do it the way that Devin does it, which makes it truly unique. Okay, so in terms of exactly how this takes place and how Defend does what it does is essentially a behavioral biometric solution, specifically around continuously doing behavior biometrics, where we have essentially, skip ahead, where we essentially have a number of IPs that have been patents that have been generated for this. A lot of R&D has been done and lab hours and articles written about the technology itself. But really at its core, it's biometric, right? But it's done slightly different than your traditional biometrics methods, which is body structure. For a strong authentication to happen, there needs to be 2 or more factors essentially achieved within that authentication. The first factor typically would be something you know, right? A password, user identification number of some type of PIN. And the second is something you have, right? Would be cryptography, identification device, a token of some sort. And third, something you are, right? A fingerprint, facial recognition, Windows Hello, those different methods that are out there now. Even a retinal scan would be another example of that. This, however, implies extra devices, right? Employee concerns, additional things that an employee contract would have to include and agree on, that your information is being collected somewhere and used for authentication methods, right? And as we know, fingerprints have been used in a large number of different scenarios as we know it today, right? You'll see it a lot in law enforcement, government, and the like, essentially. So what we set out to do at Plurilock was to go ahead and explore other alternatives from the standard fingerprint or facial recognition methods of using biometrics, which would be the skeletal structure and musculature of the body part, which at first to most people would seem pretty difficult to observe and measure. However, there is a way of doing this. And the way we do this is by doing the micro expressions of your keystrokes and identifying specifically how you keystroke. And funny enough, we all have our own way of using the keyboard and striking the keys in a certain manner or cadence that makes it very unique to us, in which we build a profile around that helps us to be able to protect the machine uniquely for me and anybody else that would potentially have the Defend running on it. And in this case, as I showed you earlier, with me working on the demonstration there on my specific machine. The other point I want to make about the Defend is that, again, like I said, it's unique, right? And it's continuous. So it's not a situation where I've authenticated once, I'm using my machine and actively working, an hour at a time, I'm potentially there, or maybe stepping away, like I said, not having my screen locked and leaving my machine vulnerable potentially, but it happens every couple of seconds. So in the event that something were to happen within that space of time, this information would be picked up with the Defend product. And again, the one other thing about it too that's different from the others is that it doesn't require any extra hardware, right? We don't need a fingerprint scan. We don't need like a camera in order to take facial recognition image of our face in order to authenticate. So you don't need that. And last, it makes it very frictionless, right? There's no specific action required for the user. You don't have to sign in. You don't have to remember your password. You basically work and operate as you normally would in your regular day. So that makes it very easy to use and very useful for us to be able to do it from a user standpoint. And it's very non-intrusive. And the last thing that I want to make a point here is that within the product itself is it's not looking at what you're doing so much, but how you do it, right? So we're not concerned necessarily about the application you're using. We're not recording, the specific, information, as it were, for example, in the email I was sending. We're not concerned about that, but exactly how you are going about accessing that specific application in terms of your typing and keystrokes, like I mentioned. And so based on that, like I said, we're only doing is taking the numeric biometric data and then basically sending it off, which I'll show you in the next slide, in terms of being able to collect that and log that information. Another thing to note here, as well as we've won a bunch of awards, and like I said, a bunch of R&D has been done for the product. So it's definitely been recognized in the industry. So now let's take a quick look at the actual components and the integration of the system itself. We're looking at basically three main components here. We'll start with the first, which is the agent, or better yet, a scanner for all intents and purposes, because it's not storing any data locally in any way. And again, like I said, it's not concerned about the specific data, but more so the numeric biometrics data that it needs to store based on your typing style and cadence. We only take basically that numeric data, like I say, so secure that and then pass it along to the second required component, which would be the Defend cloud console hosted in the tenant in AWS. And then finally, the Defend administration console, which I'll access a little later in this webinar, for accessing the logs and settings, which gives you the capability of being able to modify and configure the services as you need. Okay. Another huge component for us here that's also makes it very, very ideal is the fact that we can leverage these other components that you would have in your security stack, right? Once we've collected all this information, we can extend the products and services to external IDPs, for example, that support OpenID Connect standard. Stuff like Google or Salesforce or any of those other, you can actually connect and tie in based on the identity that's been verified with Defend, can be pushed out via that method. And we take the identity information and we basically share it via API to a SIM, for example, or a tool like a SOAR that can optimize processes and allow orchestration of different technologies and the standardization response procedures for each type of attack. So again, we're collectively doing this, building up a workflow, if you will, and like I said, leveraging the true identity of the endpoint and then sending that off, which is definitely very valuable. Okay, additionally, the only other thing I'd like to mention here is that frequency of checking by the API or signals, like I said, inputting to a SIM or a database, all of this information can be actionable items that you could use, like I said, again, with these other tools that would allow you to be able to leverage them and take and use their skills or their capabilities to be able to take action to secure your networks even better. So that spot check and frequency of that is definitely very useful. So when we look at the security stack as a whole, right, most of what we're looking at, they all have to answer some questions, right? Malware asks the question, hey, is the process good or bad typically? You know, in DLP, should the user have access to this data? Or are they, you know, adhering to the corporate policies and procedures when they are using it? Along with that, you could have IDPs. Hey, is this packet bad or is it good? You know, you got your UEBA, which typically, you know, looks at things like actions. Is this action considered normal or is this abnormal? And then PAM, of course, does the user have rights to access this particular resource? And so all of these are great questions to need answers. However, there's still one unanswered question. And is that really comes down to whether or not it is truly the user or not. Hence where Plurilock Defend comes in to give you that, you know, ultimate and final factor that's missing from each one of those to determine whether or not the user is truly who they are. So just prior to me kind of wrapping things up, I'm going to jump into the admin console here and show you some of the continuous logging that was captured during the first portion of this webinar. Okay, so let me just switch gears here and we'll log into the console real quick. Now in the administration console, we're going to focus on the continuous authentication piece and the log specifically. As I mentioned to you before, there is the capabilities of customizing this to increase the sensitivity or decrease the sensitivity of how aggressive the Defend solution is actively monitoring your keystrokes as you continue to work. Okay, I'm going to jump into my log specifically here. Okay, so you'll see here right away, there was 2 lockouts that happened during the course of the demonstration I gave you earlier. You'll see here the PowerShell. This is the first attack that I was mentioning to you, the passive one that would be more, like I said, typically undetected, where they were running scripts and so forth. And like I said, the Mimikatz would have been used to pull those credentials and then execute on the machine. You'll see that it was logged out at the beginning of our session here, and you'll see that that's been captured. Second, you'll see that I was using Outlook while I was trying to send that internal malicious email internally, having gained access to the attacker's machine and sending that off for a wire transfer or something of some type, or maybe even, you know, sending malware or a link to an internal employee, and then, like I said, kind of potentially live off the land, if you will, potentially by sending that and having it deployed. But again, there'd be that trust relationship between the employees internally that would be an advantage to the attacker in that type of scenario. So it'd be very damning if that were to happen. But again, Defend, you saw, was able to actively lock out the machine, having the ability to be able to determine that my typing specifically, which I was doing with single fingers, to to contrast what my normal typing cadence would be, where I use all 10 of my fingers. So that's how that happened, just so in case you were wondering about how it initiated on my machine. Okay, but if somebody else were to stand up and do the same thing, there obviously would be very unique. And again, hence the same situation would occur where the machine would get locked out. Okay, so here we'll just take a look at some of the entries within in a given entry here. So you'll see the first column here, we've got the ID, which is uniquely identified in the system. As the information is collected, a unique identifier is associated with every log entry within the Defend console. Second, you'll see the match sensitivity. I have mine set to medium, a little bit more aggressive than typical, but again, this can be calibrated to suit fit depending on what your organization's needs are. You can go a little bit higher or a little bit less and less aggressive. Second, you'll see the profile there. The profile is basically assigned to the individual device component that's being used. This is very specific to the keyboard you use, the mouse you use. So if I were to actually use an external keyboard in this case, that would have a different profile potentially and be stored there because it's per device. Okay. Next, you have the date, and then we have the identity score, which determines how closely is this a match to Edwin's real profile, to him, right? And again, that profile that gets generated initially basically can vary, right? It depends on how actively I'm using the environment while the profile is being built. It can take anywhere for half a day to a day if I use it very infrequently, or even more potentially. But again, the more actively I use it, the quicker my profile will be built, and then I'll be able to basically match my profile against any abnormal behavior or somebody that may be impersonating me on my machine. Again, then we have the active process, right? The application initiates the actual log will be the one active. In this particular case, it's Outlook. Previously saw it was PowerShell, and all the keystrokes and all the work that I'm doing on the machine as a user will be captured in terms of the active process. And then there's a process ID associated with it. And then the match decision, which basically determines that, hey, that is definitely not the user, or I'm seeing behavior in terms of keystrokes that don't match that initial profile. And hence the no match comes up. You get the red indication of that, and the machine gets locked out. And last but not least, the notes that can be used for your administrators in terms of making any kind of information that need to potentially share with the rest of the team or your security operations center. Okay, so that basically covers off the admin console and how Defend works with the micro expressions, like I mentioned to you, very uniquely driven on the endpoint, and helps to protect the endpoint, like I said, over and above your security stack that you currently have, because you may, like I said, have malware and a lot of other different solutions that are actively in use. But this would be, like I said, in addition to that, and helping to strengthen your security posture as a whole. All right. So I think that's the portion that I have here. I think the next thing we were going to do is probably take some question and answers. Step into the questions piece here to see if we can find out what you guys think about it.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Edwin. So we'll go ahead and certainly take some time for questions now. So just a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the chat box. So yes, looks like, we have a first question here. So are you ready, Edwin?
Yes.
Okay. The first question is, how long does it take to build a profile?
Right. So I kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier, but yes, that profile can be built and it varies depending on the usage on the machine itself, or the user actively using the machine. So as a profile starts to get generated, if I'm actively using it, it could take anywhere between a half a day or so, or it could take a little bit longer depending on how frequent and actively I'm using the machine. That's typically.
Okay. Here's the next one. What about the different keyboards and pointers?
So they're built, ideally a profile is per device. So again, I think I may have mentioned it earlier as well. If I were to switch my keyboard out or use a different mouse, all of that would be per device itself. So we build that profile against that device. That way it's uniquely tied to it. Because if you had a QWERTY keyboard, it's going to be a little different than your native keyboard on your laptop. And so those you'd be striking at a different cadence, and it would be definitely from a biometric standpoint would differ. And so we want to make sure we capture that. So again, it's per device.
Okay, got it. Here's the other one. Does it still work if users rely on password managers to enter the credentials?
So yes and no. Some products work with the password managers, while Pluraloc's products make password managers, far less necessary, right? So obviously we're, basically, actively doing this on a continual basis. So we're ensuring that we're securing the machine via that method. So like I said, they work with some of them, but again, based on the nature of the product itself or the solution, it's far less necessary.
Okay. So the next one reads as, what can Defend be used for?
Right. So typically one of our most common use cases for Defend is the multi-factor MFA at login and the continual authentication basically throughout the day. So again, there's very few products or solutions out there that would continually authenticate this. MFA, like I mentioned to you before, has some weaknesses or vulnerabilities in it. And so this would be an added layer on top of that that would help to better secure your machine on a continuous basis. Again, like I said, every couple of seconds, as opposed to doing it at one point in time.
Okay, so looks like we talked about ZTA. So the other question is with regards to it, how does this support my zero trust framework and environment?
Right. So I kind of mentioned a little bit about the NIST requirement and what Pluraloc's vision was in terms of building Defend. And it really is to satisfy that continuous authentication. So again, you may have a single point in time authentication take place. However, it's not continuous. So in order for us to be able to really get closer to that picture of becoming, a zero trust, we would have to have that happen continuously. And Defend does just that.
Okay, that's good. And the other one is, how resource hungry is Defend or the solution?
Yeah, so very lightweight. Again, it sits on the endpoint, as you saw in that diagram with the integrations. And it essentially, like I said, basically doesn't store any data locally on the box. So you don't have to worry about storage and so forth. It basically secures that information. Again, the biometric numeric information, not what you're doing, but that numeric information that needs to be logged in the console, which I have on the screen, and basically sends that securely up to the AWS tenant and allows the administrators to go in there and take action, as you saw I did just moments ago.
Okay, got it. So it looks like here's another one with regards to the profile data. So the question is, how is the user profile data stored? Is it like actually secure?
It is. Again, it's encrypted. So again, encrypted on the AWS tenant platform. So again, all that information that is generated, like I said, between the time that the profile is started or initiated, captures that data in terms of uniquely identifying your keystrokes. And again, that is also stored at the tenant at AWS.
Okay. So here's another interesting one. Why is behavioral biometrics better than the traditional biometric solutions like the fingerprint scans?
Right. So again, all the fingerprint scans are great. However, it requires the device to have that capability on it. Whereas in our case, it's completely non-intrusive, right? I don't need to scan with a fingerprint. I don't need the device to have that capability. I don't need a camera. It's business as usual for an end user. So essentially it runs on the machine and you continue to do work as you normally would. So non-intrusive and frictionless.
Got it. The other one is Defend scalable?
Absolutely. As a SaaS product, Defend is quite scalable. We do have and a lot of government, military or other clients that require it to be on-prem. We have the capability of doing that as well to deploy it on-prem. So it's very scalable. depending on the organization's needs, and we can definitely customize that.
Got it. So let me go through this. I think I have one more year. I want to know more and or to see Plurilock in action. Is this possible?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you have our friends on the call actually that can help out as well. We've got marketing as well as sales, and you can direct us, basically contact us directly, and we can definitely set up a demonstration for you guys to and customize it to whatever your specific requirements are. Absolutely.
Awesome. So looks like, we have covered all of our questions here. So Edwin, is there anything else you want us to cover before we wrap up?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Like I said, it really is just, from my experience in the industry, I feel like Defend is one of those unique products, like I said, that really answers that ultimate question, right? I think, ultimately, that level of security is great, and having that security stack is wonderful. But having that extra unanswered question definitely is beneficial, I think, and would be beneficial to most organizations.
Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.